Hello everyone, this is Moth, that's M-A-W-T-H, and this is my first video. I have an interest in media and all different types of literacy that stem from it, whether it be digital, cultural, or critical, to name a few, and how they intersect with the Black experience, specifically in the United States. I intend to maintain some anonymity so that I can freely talk about different subjects with clarity and integrity, not always having to worry about how sensitive topics will affect my personal life. With that out of the way, let's get to the topic of the day, Paul Mooney and what he tells us about media literacy from the Black American perspective. Quick disclaimer at the top, I will not be discussing the sexual assault allegations levied against Mooney. I couldn't find a way to seamlessly mention them without it being a complete detour, but more importantly, I couldn't find any sources that I felt comfortable trusting to be definitive either for or against him. Hopefully that is a reasonable explanation for most people. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something by the end of it. Paul Mooney's status as something of the ultimate Black uncle of comedy was and is a conflicting position to hold. He never got to be a major headliner on the stage or the screen, but without his writing and influence, many of the star comedians we have today would not exist. It's somewhat hard to tell whether this was fully his intention, never willing to compromise himself as an artist or as a Black man, or if the prejudiced Hollywood machine is largely to blame, full stop. Even after reading his biography, Black is the New White, which will be cited often in this video, the answer is muddled, due additionally in no small part to his being connected at the hip to an all-time great of their shared craft in Richard Pryor for the vast majority of his career. Paul Gladney was born August 4th, 1941 in Shreveport, Louisiana, but it'll be fair to say that Paul Mooney, as we would come to know him, experienced a different kind of nativity in the late 60s on Sunset Boulevard when he first met his lifelong friend Richard Pryor. It is not an over-exaggeration to see this moment as a rebirth of sorts. Mooney essentially opens the book with he and Pryor's friendship, charting a through line from chapter to chapter that emphasizes him as arguably the most important person in his life, second only possibly to his grandmother, affectionately named Mama. Together, Richard and Paul would form a fruitful but troubling duo, with Pryor being the sex and drug-addicted frontman, and Mooney being the other man behind the curtain. Mooney did not rest on his laurels despite having steady work as a writer for Richard's stand-up, TV shows, and movies, doing his own comedy sets at smaller club venues, having his own acting career, and starting a business or two along the way. In fact, Paul details in the book that dancing was his first real talent since he was a teenager, appearing on Dance Party, an early West Coast rendition of American Bandstand. It was here that he would get his first taste of being a performer in front of an audience larger than his family and meet his arch nemesis, the industry. Paul Mooney's distaste for Hollywood is pretty well documented. He spends a large part of his comedy sets in his book dissecting the conflicts, contradictions, and overt racism in the American entertainment industry, and in a way the country more broadly. He would lambast the work of some of his fellow Black comedians like Bill Cosby or Garrett Morris for catering their performance to the white gaze, either performing the role of the acceptable Negro or the buffoon criminal caricature, respectively. More compassionately, he recognized the internal conflict that weighed heavily on Pryor, the constant grappling of wanting more fame, money, and recognition for his talents, but knowing that the only people who can award such things are a majority white audience who would try to box in his performances into one of the two aforementioned categories. Such conflicts persist to this day within many a Black artist. With all that being said, this was never Paul's internal conflict. In his mind, his humor and artistic skill would shine through to the people it was meant to, and everyone else was largely irrelevant or ignorant. Due in no small part to his upbringing and raw talent, he did not intend to settle for being a stereotype or anyone's production. Crucially, he was not as willing to put himself through any sort of emotional torment to make ends meet. Mooney would work whatever odd jobs he needed to support himself and his family, from when he was a teen and picked fruit and vegetables during the summer to when he became a ringmaster for a short time. He often suppressed his ego while maintaining his dignity, but he still suffered for it. This is a very important part that we're going to come back to later. So as Mooney made his way into Hollywood, his roles reflected this hard work and honest living. He was in a documentary called FTA in 1972. The documentary covered the traveling roadshow for soldiers fighting in Vietnam called Fuck the Army, although they had to change it to Free the Army officially for obvious reasons. After that role, between helping Richard on many of his projects, he would get cast to play Sam Cooke in the 1978 film The Buddy Holly Story, and in true Mooney fashion, he made the role his own and ad-libbed some lines that played up the regality of Cooke in the face of discrimination.
No, I'm a good man. Entourage. You see, these three young men of Caucasian persuasion, why, they happen to be his personal valets. They fulfill his every need. So therefore, they must have rooms next to his. Mr. Cook, you mean to tell me you got 3 white valets?
That is correct.
Excuse me, Mr. Cook, will you be wanting your bath immediately or after your rub down?
Not now, boy.
Always emphasizing the strength and resolve of the black community, but without being preachy or trying to copy mainstream white culture. A role I also found interesting is his brief appearance in Robert Townsend's Hollywood Shuffle as the president of the NAACP Hollywood chapter. He's only in the movie for literally 1 minute, but delivers one of the funniest lines in "We'll never play the Rambos until we stop playing the Sambos." Another line that I'm sure he ad-libbed or punched up to make even better than it was in the script. Also, I'm going to be doing a Paul Mooney impersonation throughout this every now and again. If you're annoyed by it, get over it or click off, but I'm going to do it. I'm sorry. And for the first third of his career, that was the name of the game. Go onto a film set for a small role, kill it, and go back to the stage or assistant prior. There wasn't much of a reason to reach for a starring role. He got consistent work as a comic and a writer, and being a head learner came with too much compromise and too much baggage. That all would have to come to a change in 1986 when Richard Pryor was diagnosed with MS, and in the early 90s his health would take a precipitous decline. Paul's longtime friend and comedy partner could no longer serve as the public-facing vessel for their shared brilliance, causing a seismic shift in both his personal life and professional life. Let it not be said or thought that Paul Mooney was an overly introverted or shy man. While he doesn't say it explicitly in the book, his lack of a comedy special before Richard's physical deterioration did not come from a lack of motivation. If I may speculate a bit here, I think Paul viewed comedy as more of a collaborative effort, an art form that can be made better with others. He could rarely find a group of people who didn't view his brand of comedy as incendiary, so having someone like Richard, who himself was very unfiltered and honest, to bounce ideas off of was super critical. By losing Richard, he was forced to elevate himself beyond the level of just a collaborator. He was still never going to be the star, but he was going to make a name for himself even without his best friend. When Keenan Ivory Wayans and his brothers were creating the classic sketch comedy show In Living Color, Mooney was one of the first people they went to. At the beginning of a major transitional period, he initially declined, probably because of the negative experience he had writing for a major network in the past when he worked with Richard on SNL. The show would go on to be successful, but with the typical increased scrutiny and studio meddling that most productions creatively headed by black people receive. Mooney had to deal with people trying to tone him down yet again, just like they had done before on Saturday Night Live and The Richard Pryor Show, but he would find a way to let his true voice ring out where else but on the stage. Race, a comedy album by Paul Mooney, will be released in 1993. Its cover is a double entendre and a role reversal of black and white in Black and White, two staples of Paul's comedy, the double entendre being that this album heavily features racial commentary, and he has 3 white men about to run a race on his mark, the role reversal being that it's usually black athletes being told when to move by a white officiant, but this time the black man has the starter pistol, and it's the white men who will be doing the running. I know this may come off as fairly obvious to many, but I still love the tone that the album cover sets as his recording comedy special debut. Just a year later, in 1994, he would follow up Race with Masterpiece. Yet another double meaning, but this time with a more subdued cover. Considering the overall subject matter of both routines are the same, they came out back to back. Let's take a break from the history portion for a moment and focus in on these 2 albums. Instead of me going line by line and butchering the delivery, I suggest you pause the video right here and just go listen to them yourself. They're only about an hour long each. I'll be here when you get back. Alright, so I'm just going to assume that you either listen to them now or have before and proceed as if that's the case. Maybe by today's standards, these are routines people have heard already tangentially via the likes of Chris Rock, Chappelle, maybe a little Roy Wood Jr. and so on, but of course that's the point. Whether directly by sharing a stage with him, having him write for them, or just being an audience member, many of today's politically inclined black comedians copy the cadence, material, or general aesthetic that Paul Mooney embodied naturally. Therefore, his thoughts and opinions have circulated within the black community for decades subconsciously and has had its benefits and its consequences. Unknowingly, I have to preface this next section by saying this. I know what a joke is. And I'm aware that much of what Paul Mooney says on stage should be taken in jest, but that doesn't mean that you can't take a critical look at some of the motifs and themes that he frequently returns to. When it comes to comedy, a single joke here and there is just a joke whether it is well executed or not. but a repeated mantra or sentiment speaks to the frame of mind of the comedian. As a fan of comedy and someone who studies media and cultural literacy, it frustrates me both how much people completely misinterpret a comedy performance and how many comedians hide behind the trappings of their profession to cover up overt bigotry and prejudice. Sometimes the audience lacks the critical thinking to correctly interpret a joke, and other times comedians deflect genuine criticism by playing on this ignorance. The inherent difficulties of this dichotomy aside, I think there is a lot to be learned from Paul Mooney's career in comedy. To those who are about to go down into the comments and say something along the lines of, it's just jokes, or why do people have to take everything so serious, or my least favorite phrase of all time, it's not that deep, I have this to say. If you'll repeat it, we need to talk about it. Any piece of media that you hear, see, or interact with that sticks in your mind after you take it in means that the message that it's presenting is either something you already believe or something that you are being primed to believe. The influence of media, especially an art form like comedy, attaches itself to you at a subconscious level and reverberates out into the world. The much repeated phrases, art imitates life, and its inverse, life imitates art, are very simple notions but are very influential and powerful concepts in practice. The main framework that I'll be viewing Paul Mooney's comedy through is a concept that's a major pillar of how black people interact with and interpret media. At the core of this concept rests the dichotomy between being a good black person versus a bad black person, as dictated under the white gaze. Except in Mooney's case, as usual, he flips it, and instead of framing it as good or bad, it's about who keeps it real, who believes in or perpetuates the images in mainstream media, as if these two concepts are directly opposed. We're talking about staying on code. Being on code can have many definitions, and more than likely has its roots in the street code, stuff like don't talk to cops, don't snitch, all that stuff, but I'll try my best to summarize it here and put it in my own words. Staying on code in the black community means that you do three things when creating and consuming media. 1. Only buy into positive representations of black America. 2. Do not verbally attack another black person, and if you absolutely must, keep it respectable, except for two major caveats we'll get into later. And 3, I'll get to much later. Wait until the end of the video. These concepts exist to foster unity and cohesion, but it is questionable how well it works in action. A black person's very identity will be challenged or even diminished if they do not adhere to these rules, making quality media literacy a more existential concept to black people. While I respect the intent of staying on code, in the real world it can create unnecessary wedges within the black community, and it muddies the water of media comprehension. A significant example of the community staying on code, and the one Mooney brings up in Masterpiece, is the infamous O.J. Simpson murder trial, one that fascinates many people even now, even after his death. The official sentiment among black folk was that he didn't do it, but I mean, come on, he definitely did it. So much content and analysis from the barbershop to the think tank has been spent dissecting this case from all angles, so I won't spend too much time on it here. My favorite documentary of all time is O.J. Made America, where they do a brilliant job covering just about everything pertinent to the trial and Simpson's life, so just go watch that. But not now, because it's very long and I'm just now getting to my central points. So let's take the tenets of staying on code line for line. Only buy into positive representations of black America. Alright, so we start off with a tenuous and loaded concept immediately. Let's do it in reverse and talk about what exactly is a black American to begin with. Rather recently, there has been a small movement to restrict the scope of who is considered truly black in the United States. ADOS, or American Descendants of Slavery, hone in on how reparations would be disseminated to the black American population if they were to pass, and they've taken it upon themselves to define what black is for everyone else. In a nutshell, they're attempting to make a clear delineation between peoples who have immigrated from African nations post-slavery and those of African descent in the Caribbean, and American-born African peoples whose ancestry goes back to chattel slavery. It would probably take several hours to explain the necessary nuances for the case being made by ADOS and or the one made by their detractors, but to summarize not only my personal perspective, but the one pertinent to this conversation on media literacy, there is no meaningful, universal definition of being black or blackness that will suffice to cover even one nation, let alone one as diverse as the United States of America, and any attempt to do so will inevitably start to be framed by white supremacist ideology, as it is this ideological framework that established the original rudimentary definition of blackness to begin with. In short, you're really just doing white supremacist work by actively trying to divide us. It's imperialist and neocolonial, gatekeeping who is and who is not black based on arbitrary criteria outside of an individual's control is difficult and ultimately superfluous. I actually think this is a win for Paul. He never denies anyone's blackness despite the damage they may have done to the image of the overall community, but he does question if these people even want to consider themselves black or contribute anything to our collective progress. Which leads us to the matter of what constitutes a positive image of black people. The quick and cute answer is that there are so many permutations of blackness in the African diaspora, then what is considered positive must also have many answers. But that's just skin deep. The driving force behind what is the ideal in the US is mainstream white culture. For the most part, Paul Mooney admonishes those that seek to placate this demographic, again fulfilling any manner of stereotypes from the crying slave in a period piece to the inner city gangster or even a pop sensation that dances for fried chicken. I'm looking at you, MC Hammer.
Delicious, crispy, bite-sized morsels. A whole new way to enjoy the Colonel's chicken.
Come on, Hammer.
The problem was, no one could get him to go on until the last piece was gone.
Now that's pop.
There are many caricatures that a black person may be asked to become if they want to act, sing, or direct, or whatever may have you. A major complication is when the matter of authenticity gets thrown into the mix. Not every realistic depiction of the black experience is going to be one that makes people feel good or is aspirational. Oftentimes, a pass will be given to media and art that gives a raw representation of blackness, usually in either rap, graffiti, crime drama shows, and so on. And the line for what's being authentic versus what's just being crass is going to be different for everybody. Hip-hop has been given a very wide latitude to explore topics like the perils of growing up in poverty and under a police state that demonizes your race, or the conflicts that exist between black women and black men, but it can be argued that at least the rapping portion of hip-hop has kind of turned into a farce due in large part to this lack of restraint, or relaxing of being on code, if you will, but that's another topic for another day. While depicting a less than good black experience and spreading constructive messaging are not directly opposed, people will often lean heavily on one aspect to assuage their lack of consideration for the other. Too much syrup and your teeth itch from all the sugar. Too much pancake and your gut is full with the heaviness of the batter. What is real and what is ideal need to be balanced so that genuine representation can be shown, and more importantly, progress can be made. But let's get back to Mooney. He was setting up for a golden era, but before that peak, he would go through potentially one of the worst decades of his life. After the release of Masterpiece in 1994, Mooney enters something of a blank period for about a decade. He doesn't make many appearances, write on many projects, or release a special during this time. One performance that sticks out is his small role in Spike Lee's Bamboozled. He's essentially playing a fictionalized version of himself, working small clubs and making a living catering his performance to a black audience and not selling out to make large amounts of money. It's a simple but important role in a movie that was incredibly caustic to mainstream audiences upon release, something Mooney is far too familiar with at this point, yet it doesn't even get a mention in his book. This general time period is marked by continual loss for Paul on a personal level as well. He loses his beloved grandmother Mama in the year 2000. Then the following year, his youngest son Simeon is murdered by what was supposed to be a close friend. And to cap it off, Richard Pryor would eventually succumb to his illness in 2005. Perhaps this professional lull and personal hardship would calcify some of the rougher edges of Mooney's persona. In his return to the stage with his new special, Analyzing White America, he notably appears a lot more serious and subdued with his on-stage persona. The delivery is still sharp and witty, but his stage presence and facial expressions are much plainer and a lot less animated. The cover art and the subject matter of the album are even a little darker. A similar phenomenon can be seen in one of Paul's great contemporaries, George Carlin, who took a hard heel turn into what would be considered today edgy comedy after bouts of substance abuse, the accompanying health issues, and some personal loss. Carlin would attack and dissect American culture with a fury that can only come from someone like him. More on him in the next video. This leads me to the second tenet, not publicly attacking one another unless necessary, and if so, doing it in a respectful manner.
I got parents. And you know what my parents taught me? Don't fight in front of white people.
To reveal my age a bit, I wasn't even 10 years old when The Chappelle Show first came out in 2003. But like many little black kids at the time, I wasn't going to let something like an age warning or viewer advisory stop me from seeing it. Every few years, black people create a show that resonates deeply with just about everyone in the community. It was Sanford and Son in 72, Good Times in 74, The Cosby Show in 84, revisionist history be damned, The Arsenio Hall Show in 89, In Living Color in 90, Martin in 92, and so on and so on. For a brief time, Chappelle would have his time in the sun as the leading star of a black comedy show, but the social and emotional costs of fame would take their toll, and he would bow out early. I get the impression that this mentality endeared the two comedians to one another, Paul finally finding a kindred spirit in the comedy world in Dave after losing Pryor. In the first season, Paul, emerging from his quiet period, does a skit on the Chappelle Show called Ask a Black Dude, wherein he answers questions from mostly white men about different stereotypes about black men and black culture. In true Mooney fashion, he answers earnestly and comically about his views on the matters in question. Perhaps still grieving and returning to form, this is actually one of his more subdued performances. The second season would feature Mooney a bit more prominently, and alongside Donnell Rawlings and Charlie Murphy, the show would reach an even greater peak, becoming maybe one of the best seasons of a comedy show of all time. Maybe the skit that Mooney is best remembered for is when he plays a black seer named Negro Damas, where he essentially continues to answer questions levied at him by mostly white people about the black experience, only this time invoking the image and demeanor of a wise, ancient fortune teller. It's a bit more structured and less spontaneous than the previous sketch, most of the jokes being from specials of the past or those to come. However, for his final appearance on the Chappelle Show, the audience would get the full Mooney experience in just 2 scathing minutes in a sketch called Mooney on Movies. In his tried and true fashion, Paul analyzes 3 films from his perspective as a black man in America, flanked by 2 blonde white women who introduce the premise of the film and offer limited commentary. You can tell that a lot was probably left out on the editing room, and I'm not entirely sure that the 2 women's uncomfortableness was for effect or genuine, but he gets his points across about how he felt about Gone with the Wind, Barbershop, and The Last Samurai. He briefly demonstrates how what is considered a good film by white Americans often has hidden layers of racism, either in the pages of the script or behind the scenes when the film stops rolling. Hattie McDaniel gets treated like a second-class citizen, both as a character and when the film is awarded. His 2 co-hosts unsurprisingly have nothing much to say about the film Barbershop, leaving Mooney to make a quick quip in the space of their silence.
Barbershop is a smart comedy about a day in the life of a black barbershop on the south side of Chicago. It is owned by Ice Cube and inhabited by a colorful cast of characters who bicker with one another in various hilarious ways. Recently, a sequel was made.
You know it's just a front. They sell drugs out of barbershops.
Finally, he pokes fun out of the necessity, nay, the insistence, that Hollywood always finds a way to shoehorn in a white savior character. With the momentum from the Chappelle Show to propel him, in 2004, Paul would briefly get his own show called Judge Mooney. It's basically a much worse and blacker version of courtroom TV. I have not seen much of Judge Mooney, but I can say confidently that it's terrible, and I am genuinely shocked Paul took it. He seems happy during filming, but the show is full of so many nasty stereotypes and has such terrible acting that I think he was smiling harder for the check he got from them rather than the experience of making the product. Going back to the code, you can argue that he is still staying in line with rule number 2, but bending rule number 1. Mercifully, it only would last about 7 episodes, but Mooney was reaching the end of his run on television, capstoned by a notorious moment at the 2005 Comedy BET Awards. Before I get to the incident, let's take a quick look at what drives a comedian to go on stage and perform in the first place. In the world of comedy that Richard Pryor and Paul Mooney helped to shape, getting laughs from the audience was maybe the main way you knew you were killing, but there are other metrics and philosophies that would arise as comedians kept pushing the envelope. To a certain type of comedian, it is almost considered a badge of honor to have people hate you and your material. To others, the main goal is laughter and by extension making people feel good. Popular guys like Gabriel Iglesias or Jeff Dunham aren't going to shy away from being crass or pushing buttons, but their style is ultimately to keep the audience on their side, always bringing the jokes back to a safe space of sorts where no one is challenged too coarsely. A growing trend now is to reach this safe space by ruining other people's, usually done by conservative comedians. They take popular negative sentiments of the time, whether they be rooted in racism, misogyny, homophobia, and so on, amplify the bigotry, and make the audience feel safe by assuring them that they're in the in crowd and therefore are normal compared to the groups they hate in the out crowd. The objective here is still to get people on your side and laugh, but the comedy is usually lackluster, and sets will often devolve into just shitting all over whatever progressive concept or movement has conservative noses rankled at the time. What's truly damning is that conservative comedy has always existed and was objectively funny in the past, with guys like Norm Macdonald and the members of the Blue Collar Comedy Tour as good examples of how having a more traditional perspective can still be hilarious. At the end of the day, however, the modern offerings aren't really funny and barely qualify as comedy. What Paul often sought to do, and what notably the likes of Patrice O'Neal attempted to do during his own career, was to tell your truth as raw as possible while still keeping it funny, making it so that the only people leaving are those who are too sensitive to handle the set and therefore not in your crowd to begin with, filtering down to just the diehards and others willing to hear your point of view. For Paul, the jokes are never intended to run people off or make people feel bad, but if they do, so be it. There is a stark difference between what Mooney did at the 2005 BET Comedy Awards and what Michael Richards did a year later at the Laugh Factory. Being offensive was never the point. It was just a side effect of detailing the plight and struggles of black people as opposed to the privilege of white people within a comedy set. The Wikipedia page does a pretty good job of breaking it down and simplifying it, but I'll put it in my own words for those that don't like to read. Basically, Mooney was giving out his own fake awards for black people who he felt needed to stop trying to increase their proximity to whiteness at the expense of their blackness. To some, he may have made the mistake of breaking that second rule of staying on code, not criticizing each other in public. Diana Ross had gotten arrested a few years prior for a DUI, and Paul Mooney proceeded to make fun of her like he would any other celebrity. But to some, he crossed the line, especially when he made a mention to her recently deceased husband. Tracy Ellis Ross, Diana's daughter, was in attendance and would storm out in tears. His sketch was pretty much edited out of the show, and Mooney showed zero remorse, insinuating that if you were one of the top white comedians of the time, no one would care about what he said. And here's where we have to take a moment to really analyze the second rule of the code. In practice, there are actually two exceptions for rule number 2 that I have witnessed. You can't criticize your fellow black person in public except when it's a woman, or for lack of a better term, a lesser man. Despite upsetting many at the time, it does not appear that making fun of Diana Ross the way he did set his career back any. And in fact, in his next special, 2007's Know Your History, Jesus is Black, So is Cleopatra, he would use the same joke again, just without mentioning her husband. Due to the inherent misogyny of society and the particularities of it within the black community, publicly making fun of and harshly critiquing black women is quite normal and accepted for the most part. The only other group who has had it just as bad is any black man who isn't seen as manly or a man enough, principally queer black men, but also plus-size black men, the mentally handicapped, black men who struggle financially, all are considered fair game for ridicule. Basically, if rule number 1 can be classist and nationalist, the issue with rule number 2 is that it is patriarchal. The only people deserving of no critique or who can't even be made fun of in the slightest are black men who fit the hegemonic masculine ideal. To briefly explain the HMI, which I find is one of the most consistent sociological theories, the hegemonic masculine ideal image basically suggests that there is a checklist for what a man should strive to be in America. Physically fit, intelligent, white, heterosexual, wealthy, a domineering personality, born male. Basically, a look at everyone that has played James Bond, and that is what is considered the golden standard of what it is to be a good man in society. And if you fit the bill, no one should be allowed to ever say anything bad about you ever. It's what everybody's been protesting about, rightfully so. When people challenge ideals of the elite, it's considered punching up. When making fun of people of a lower social status, it's considered punching down. Comedians can choose to do one or the other, but which is more acceptable changes with the social climate and the given audience. Between this incident and his remaining specials, I've teetered back and forth on whether I think Mooney is a misogynist who punches down or not. To be clear, on some level we all have biases against women that is inherent to society, but what might cross him over into willful antagonistic misogyny is the intensity and glee he gets from ragging on many of the women in Hollywood and music, both in his book and in his specials. When looking at it intersectionally, meaning focusing on the entire demographic makeup of the people he targets, he punches either up or on level with his peers. Diana Ross, Aretha Franklin, and Janet Jackson are all black women, a heavily marginalized group, but they're all also wealthy and have a higher socioeconomic status than he does. And just as important, the jokes don't necessarily play off stereotypes, but rather the personal conduct of each individual. And I'm sure Paul won't make me look like an idiot for this section later in the video. At the core of Mooney is a constant us versus them mentality. House nigga versus field nigga, man versus woman, black versus white. All the while, Paul usually roots for the underdog, rarely punching down. You get the impression that he saw himself as something of a revolutionary in comedy, but noticeably not outside of comedy, and it's easy to see how he might come to the conclusion considering the overarching systems he was up against. Whenever Mitzi Shore, the owner of the famous venue The Comedy Store in West Hollywood, fought to continue the practice of not paying amateur comics, in 1979, Paul and many others boycotted the establishment. Similar to how NCAA players were treated by colleges before NIL deals became a thing, Mitzi tried to justify not paying young comedians because they were getting paid in exposure to talent agents and sharpening their material. All the while, Shore was always renovating the venue, she paid everyone else on staff, and she even paid veteran comics, some would say washed up has-beens like her husband. In any case, I wasn't there, but it certainly seems like she was just trying to save money by having a larger stock of free labor, a tale as old as America, a tale that Mooney had long grown tired of. This is probably the part where I start to lose some people. After consuming so much of Mooney's content, you notice the near omnipotence and omnipresence given to the white American power structure within both entertainment and the nation more broadly. It's no wonder that so many black folks feel the need to both gatekeep and consistently praise all black media. Rule number 3 is to never uplift white media at the expense of black media. This is an attempt to combat the all-seeing eye, but it seeks to stop the problem at the branches instead of the roots. Like many black men of his generation, Paul had a deep mistrust of white America, and he always expected to be let down, hoodwinked, or manipulated. He witnessed the prejudice of pre-civil rights movement USA front and center, and he could never bring himself to just brush those feelings aside once he made it an entertainment like so many of his peers did. Some of his contemporaries and some later comedians would call him bitter, but I would frame it as being too principled to just avert his eyes. When the white gaze, and that's gaze spelled G-A-Z-E, don't get it twisted, stared into his soul, he stared right back and put up a mirror. He made it clear whose side he was on, and I can't think of a moment in stand-up or otherwise where he deviated from this opinion. He was trying to thread the needle between not going for the white supremacist propaganda, but also getting upset with any black person that would feed into their stereotypes. Sadly, it is nigh impossible to critique blackness publicly without these critiques being co-opted by the mainstream. I think that is the very issue that was the driving force behind Richard Pryor's internal dilemma. What does being genuinely pro-black in a white world really mean? For simple practicality's sake, a black person can afford to recuse themselves from all things Caucasian. The language we speak, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the cars we drive. Everything is framed by white American culture and white American ideals, and you have to reconcile with that in critiques of the African American experience. I say this to say that some might see Paul's comedy as bordering on respectability politics. For those that don't know, respectability politics refers to the notion that if black people would just act civilized, code for act like white people, that we as a race would be able to overcome our community's hardships. This has proven wrong time and time again, and in fact, having such a close proximity to whiteness can be an act of detriment to black people. What separates Paul from the likes of Bill Cosby or Thomas Sowell or Charles Barkley, known proponents of respectability politics, is that he doesn't advocate for sterility of culture, and he supported pro-black movements. He grew up alongside Bobby Seale, and he was the connection point between Pryor and Huey P. Newton. While I wish there was a more overt and explicit connection with the Black Panthers and their mission in his stand-up, by the time he was writing for his own specials, the Panthers had faded somewhat in relevance, Huey had been killed, and honestly, it can be difficult to make jokes about things you hold sacred and ideals you see as convictions. Maybe the fact that his own personal politics was a third rail in his comedy can be seen as a limitation of the edgy comic, but it's not as if the point of being a comedian is just to cross every line and every boundary of society. This is something that gets lost in the modern comedic landscape. Being inflammatory just for the sake of it isn't comedy. Picking your spots, subverting expectations, and pushing people to the brink and pulling them back in last second are all common tactics to get laughs from an audience, but just firing off caustic take after caustic take is just that, toxic as a motherfucker. Getting back to Rule 3 of the Code, what it represents is a deeply ingrained conflict within many black Americans. Many of us are walking contradictions. We are both the embodiment of what it means to be an American and its antithesis. The culture is widely celebrated, but the people are villainized. We highlight our strengths as a community every chance we get, but this also opens up our flaws to be examined and exploited. While Mooney adheres vehemently to the third rule, it might be the most flawed when staying on code and combined with the other two. Rule 1 of the code lacks class consciousness. Rule 2 of the code is open to misogyny and homophobia. And ultimately, Rule 3 commits the sin of being artificial or gilded. It feels like protection against the powers that be, but it's not. And I think deep down, Paul knew that even in his last days. Let's briefly discuss his final special, The Godfather of Comedy. The Godfather of Comedy can be looked at like something of a compilation album. While there is new material throughout, a lot of jokes are repeated from past specials. I'm not sure if he knew this would be his last special or not. This takes place in 2012, 3 years after the book is published. But it certainly feels like one of those farewell tours from an artist, playing all the hits one last time. Some highlights from the special is when he seeks to elevate the status of black people to that of the originators of culture, often imitated and co-opted. I'm not sure if I mentioned it so far in the video, but Paul oftentimes uses this rhetorical trick where he acts like he's forgotten the name of a celebrity he's about to analyze. The audience then responds with the answer, and it's a brilliant way to get them engaged with the set and to win the crowd over to his side, if only for a moment. I love specifically the times when he subverts it and flips it. The crowd will give the answer they think Paul means, and he'll pull the rug underneath them, zigging when they saw it zag. I can't explain it as well as he does it, so I hope you guys have been taking little breaks here and there to actually take in some of these examples. At the core of the special is Paul declaring his love for the black community. He loves Obama like many people at the dawn of his presidency. Some respectability politics sneaks in a little bit when he mentions how Barack has class and dignity, but I don't think it's much of a detraction. A bit of an anti-Caribbean sentiment is slipped in there when discussing the Rihanna Chris Brown assault. This special makes any attempt at trying to claim he isn't super misogynistic a moot point. He kind of went in on a lot of women in this special, and I wish he would have done it earlier before I gave him grace for it. But this video is taking me long enough to make, so it's staying in the script, put a mark on my permanent record, or whatever online leftists do. Anyways, to wrap, he mentions many black celebrities being under the illusion of inclusion, thinking that assimilation will lead to salvation and how that's doomed to fail. My favorite bit of wordplay and rhyming from him that I remember watching when this special first came out was his bit about white America having the complexion for the protection of the collection. I'm not really a religious guy these days, but it reminds me of how preachers speak and the skill of the rhetoric they use. It's not just the rhyming, but the delivery of it that makes it powerful. And this special is the perfect endnote for Mooney's career. It hits on all the little details that made him brilliant, if not overly edgy at times. I wouldn't say it's his best special, but it's the one where he looks the most comfortable I've ever seen him on stage. A large part of that is that, unlike a lot of specials, the audience is made up of only his core fan base. Some might be quick to say that makes it an easier audience to corral. After everything we've discussed today and his trials and tribulations, I like the idea that the last big stage he would be on, he was surrounded by the community. People who loved him and his work, and many he had inspired to take the hard path of comedy. It started as just an outlet for him to speak his mind on the state of entertainment in America and shooting the dozens with his best friend, and it ended with him achieving icon status on his terms. And while he maybe didn't always clearly and effectively deliver the political messaging of his work, he did his best to push and prod people into seeing the reality that he and so many other black people endured. After a long but shrouded career, he would suffer from dementia in the end, accosted by pale specters until May 19th, 2021. There is a concept theorized by Professor Jared Ball of Morgan State University. It's called the Vernon philosophy, named after a friend of Dr. Ball. To try to summarize it at the risk of butchering it a little bit, the Vernon philosophy basically states that searching for and pining for media that portrays black people positively is folly. To Dr. Ball and his friend, all portrayals of black people in media will be judged not by the metrics that we as a community decided, but rather will be judged by the rubric of white supremacy. In many ways, by looking over Paul Mooney's career and examining the code, I have been trying to find an angle to at least quantify the Vernon philosophy. I might be naive or overly optimistic, but it just feels so total and complete to just throw out hope for ever seeing blackness portrayed in an objectively positive light anywhere. Looking back to something I mentioned briefly, the movie Bamboozled, I think, is key. The method of staying true to your core audience works, even if the content of the stand-up is questionable. In the movie, Paul's character, Junebug, is looked down upon by his son for not achieving greater success despite his effortless skill behind the microphone. But Junebug knew, just like the man portraying him knew, that the more fame and wealth you try to accumulate, the more you'll have to tap dance and kowtow for the powers that be. Staying local so you don't run the risk of becoming a global tool against your own people. This isn't really a unique solution, but the barriers are quite difficult to overcome. Most people's ego can't handle being forced to accept smaller audiences and less fame, despite immense talent, and their households often can't sustain themselves with the smaller dollars that staying true to one's community has to offer. I think we have to start viewing the arts as a communal endeavor instead of being a largely individualistic form of expression. While buying local isn't always an effective means of praxis, to the extent that it does work, we should extend that same courtesy to our local art scene. Support your local artists because without them there is no culture. And while cultivating culture doesn't always have the same intangible effects as supporting your local plumber, fire station, humane society, and so on, it does give people purpose and reinforces community. But enough of my soapbox for now, back to Paul. I chose to talk about Mooney today for a few reasons. First, I think he was a brilliant comedian and is one of the greatest of all time, just without the big lights to prove it. And that way, he's also like my favorite rapper, MF Doom. Sometimes the respect of your peers is enough to put you on a high pedestal when mass appeal isn't possible or even valid. Second, I think Paul was incredibly media literate, save for the odd conspiracy theory here and there, but who doesn't indulge from time to time? I think it's rewarding to analyze someone who is not just a master of their art form, but who has the goal to point out said art form's inconsistencies and limitations. Third and final, I think Paul's comedy ultimately shows that staying on code can't work as intended. You can't always display black people and blackness in a positive light, and historically we've always been conflicted within community about what positive really means in any case. And recently we can't even agree who is truly black. When the time does come for public critique, there is an outsized level of emphasis on the behavior of both black women and black queers, and sometimes even a willful erasure of the discretions of black men. And even as I say all this, white folks are watching as I spill the family tea on Uncle Paul. It's an impossible situation. Funny enough, I don't think I ever came up with a definitive answer to whether Mooney himself upheld the code or broke the code with his comedy. But what I can say is that regardless of intent, he spoke on his reality. A reality that many a black man and woman shares with him and that he became an avatar of. Paul never once called himself a revolutionary, but he grew up beside and befriended them. Paul never called himself a communist, but he stood on the picket line in solidarity with his fellow comics when that's what was needed. Paul never held back, especially when you wanted him to. Above all else, Mr. Mooney kept it real. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again soon. This has been Moth, goodbye.